Hi and welcome. I'm Sally Wilson, and I have with me as my very special guest today, Alix Bradfield. Welcome, Alix.
Thank you, Sally. I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you.
I'm pleased too. We've been trying to have this conversation for a very long time, and I'm glad we've found the time now, finally. Alix. So listeners who don't know Alix has written this most extraordinary book that's based on interviews of a whole lot of specialists in their fields around boosting physical and mental health in midlife and beyond. And for people who are watching this, I'm just holding the book up now.
That's what it looks like, bright yellow.
It's bright yellow, which is actually one of my favorite colors. So Alix, in the past, you have been a career strategy consultant. You have been a columnist for the Herald. You have been a relationships counsellor.
Yes.
You've authored another book. What was that book called?
That was, the theme of that, and that was 30 years ago. That was about people who, everyone who is accepted by job loss. So it was called Job Loss, A Family Affair. Yeah. I doubt anyone would be able to find it now, but it affects that particular event, affects people well beyond the person who has lost the job.
Yeah. Thank you. So you've had several careers in your life so far.
So far, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the inspiration behind this most recent book you've written, Energy for Life?
Yes, certainly, Sal. Well, there were a few things that did inspire me to write this book. One is that we all rely on the medical profession for the wonderful help they give us when we've broken something, when we're very unwell. And little by little, I've learned that one, they don't have time to tell us how to look after ourselves. And two, sometimes maybe it's better than it used to be in the past, but the medical school doesn't actually spend a lot of time on how to prevent illness. Now, it's very interesting. The last chapter in the book is by an ICU doctor who had 20 years in ICU and then had a burnout, which is very understandable considering the pressures of that particular job. And he realized he knew very little about looking after himself, so he changed totally his lifestyle to change his life. I thought that was such an interesting element and needed to be in the book. Also, my parents happened to be the oldest couple in Australia. Between the two of them, they were 206 years old, Sal, as you will have noticed in the book. Now, I looked at their family trees, and no one in either side of the family tree had lived that long. So then I began to think, what might have been some other elements in the way they lived their life that would have contributed to such longevity. By the way, Sal, the book is not about longevity because I feel that none of us want to go on and on and on if we're not doing the things we love, if we don't feel well. So this is really about how these are tips from many, many specialists, as you said, to help us thrive and have optimum health and well-being.
Yeah. There've been some, because well-being is something that I've, been thinking about for a long time. And yet there are so many little, moments when I've been reading the book, different ways of looking at things, different perspectives. I'm just wondering, in that last chapter that you brought up, that was based on the experience of the ICU doctor, can you just talk us through some of the things that he changed in his life after his burnout experience?
Well, there are things we hear about all the time. One is a plant-based diet. He is an athlete, so on plants, he runs marathons. They've done a lot of meditation, and sleep became more of a priority. His wife also was an ICU nurse who is now working in another area of hospitalization, but with patients again. And he changed his life in terms of looking after himself and looking after the family.
Yeah. So one of the things that he changed, is it fair to say that he just slowed down a bit as well?
Well, he took time off. He had to take time off because he was burned out. I haven't spoken to him in a few months. And given all we hear about hospitals at the moment, I can't imagine he's slowed down. I imagine he's still very busy.
Right.
But hopefully he has some other habits in his life that have made that pressure a little more bearable.
Yeah.
I must talk to him. I must give him a call and see how both of them are doing with the stress of hospitals today.
Well, and as you said, all of this information has been in your head for a couple of years, and so I suppose in some instances it's hard to remember how things struck you when you first interviewed some of these experts. But I'm just wondering whether anything has come up for you where you thought in the interview, oh, well, that's different, or that's a surprise, or that's not what I would have expected. Does anything?
Well, there are a few instances of that. Now, Simon Davey, who is a founder of a lifestyle studio called Happy Melon, he has a mantra. And when I first heard that mantra, I was a bit resistant to it. The mantra is this, Sal. Busy is a reality. And we all know how busy life can be now. The second is pausing is a necessity. And the third line, which got to me, is stress is a choice. Now, my first reaction was, what do you mean stress is a choice? What do you mean? What do you mean? I mean, we've got all these external factors on us. And but the more I thought about it, and he's a very gentle man, he's very calming to be with, I realized what he was saying, that quite often, for instance, we'll be at a red light, we're late for a meeting, our stress levels go right up, we're in flight and fight mode, and that's really harming our mind and our body. And that is a choice, being at a red light. Some things, there are some very dramatic things that happen in life that may be different, but I think most of the listeners will understand the number of times we stress ourselves because we don't pause in the midst of busyness. That was very thought-provoking for me.
Yeah. And it's that, there's a quote that's attributed to Viktor Frankl, but I've recently found that it perhaps is not his, but it is between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom. I think I have that right.
Yes. Well, we always have the choice about how we're going to respond.
Yeah. A lot of us don't recognize that, do we? It's so many of our behaviors and the ways we respond are actually reactive. And they're so practiced that we actually don't realize we have a choice in the way we respond to potential stressors.
Yes, quite. And that's why he says pausing.
Yeah.
Pausing is a necessity. Because if we don't pause, we're more likely to react, as you say.
Yeah.
If we pause, we have a chance then to lower our hype and think about how we would ideally like to respond to whatever is happening.
And so, once you sort of had this mantra in your sort of awareness for a while,
yes.
Was it that you consciously applied it, or did it just become a part of how you operate in whatever environment you're in?
Well, no, I think I have to think about it all the time. If I get riled up, I need to remember what Simon said. And that also ties in with meditation, which is part of what he does. And that comes up often throughout the book in different ways. A lot of people think, oh, meditation. I mean, you have to sit cross-legged on this floor and say and it takes an hour of the day. Impossible. But it can be just being conscious of the breath. So you're at a red light, you're going to be late for the meeting, you wish you'd left earlier. And at that point, you can choose either to shout at the other cars or start breathing slowly. That calms the body down. It's an old wives' adage, isn't it? Take a deep breath. It's so true. But it's just a thing that we can we can practice more readily until it becomes, maybe it becomes a new habit. Maybe it's just something we need to practice all the time.
Yeah. And I think certainly for me, in my experience of meditation, when I was doing it in my 20s, I would meditate and then I'd kind of be annoyed that I had to go back to the real world.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and so it's, for me, it was partly learning the skill of the things that I was able to access in meditation, bringing them to the rest of my day. So I don't know if I'm strange in that, but you know, there might be some other listeners thinking, oh yeah, that's what I had to do too. Did that come up, that sort of thing come up at all?
Not specifically, but what does come up regularly is that the regular practice of meditation has an enormous impact on our lives. And, you know, many people say, well, I just don't have time. So that's where I get back to just the breath. We all have time when things are getting a bit heavy, just to pause, take some long, slow breaths and calm ourselves down before we start deciding what to do.
Yeah. And I think it's from Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, where one of the ways I think he defines meditation is one-pointed focus, which when you think about it, we're actually doing it all the time. It just depends what our focus is on, right?
Of course. Yes.
So incorporating it into our day, as you say, either focusing on the breath or for some people, the heart area. Or, you know, when we're sitting at our computer, often that's one-pointed focus. It's not necessarily the kind of one-pointed focus we want to sustain for hours and hours and hours without a break. But it's one-pointed focus. So that kind of reframes it a little bit, doesn't it?
Well, now you're reminding me of the optometry chapter. And one of the things, I've got it right here sitting in front of my computer, 20, 20, 20, to remind me. Because our focus, just as you say, our focus can be very intent on our screens. And that is something that other generations have not dealt with. So in terms of the eye strain, he just says every 20 minutes, look away 20 feet, which is about 6 meters for 20 seconds. I think even better than that, movement is mentioned throughout the book, how important it is to move. So I try and, you know, if you're really engrossed in something on the screen, it's very hard to take a break, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you get better work done when you're focused on what you're doing. But in terms of our bodies and our eyes, it is good to take a break. So at least I look into the distance, as he suggests. That is becoming a new habit. But better still, I like getting up off my chair, away from the screen for a short time, and coming back to it, because that's also moving the body.
Yep. You know, I did that for the first time this morning. I wasn't looking at a screen. I was, you know, rereading parts of the book, and I thought, oh, I better look. You know, I'd read the bit where it said, you know, look into the distance, and I looked into the distance, and I thought, oh gosh, I think that's actually blurrier than it normally is. I've probably been looking at something close to me for a bit too long. So I'll certainly be developing my awareness around that. And one of the things that, as you say, Alix, movement is addressed in so many different ways by so many of your interviewees. And we both like sport. We both like exercise. But one of the things that really got me thinking was the part on our joints.
Oh, yes. Well, Alix is a guru for me. She's almost the one who maybe was the first germ of this book.
Right.
I met her at a health retreat. She teaches joint mobility, and as you've read the book, maybe your listeners maybe haven't, she says we have synovial fluid in our joints, and some of the joint, for instance, some of our joint movements, for instance, walking, are always in the same plane, back and forth, back and forth. Yeah. She talks about our joints a little bit like hinges on doors that get rusty and eventually fall off or break unless you oil them. So she describes the synovial fluid as the oil in our joints. And the simple thing to do is just to rotate those joints. So you rotate your wrists, you rotate your elbows, you rotate your knees, your hips. And my experience of that at this health retreat is I'd heard what she had to say, and I went for a big hike. The next morning I woke up and, oh my goodness, everything was hurting. I thought I'd just stay in bed. And then I remembered what she said. I rotated the hips, rotated the knees, and I was back in business. So it was sort of miraculous for me.
Right.
And had a big impact. So I do that every day.
Do you?
Every day.
And, I love that, yes, you can use it, after the fact when you're a bit sore, but it's really about prevention, isn't it? As you said at the beginning of this interview, it's about prevention. And I, when I was reading that, I was thinking, and I looked at the exercise and I thought, oh yeah, really, you can just do them anytime. And some of them I do anyway, but I hadn't really stopped to think about the fact that doing those exercises when I don't yet feel pain is protecting my joints and setting them up for being healthy for a lot longer during my life. And it's
so just feeling better in the day. So I mean, here I am sitting at my computer, but I can do my ankles while I'm sitting here. Or my wrists and also we're both swimmers, Sal. And another thing in the book that was new to me, we've all been taught about stretching, but the osteopath has said we should not, and someone else repeated this, we should not be stretching before exercise when we're cold. We should be warming up. So for us swimming, we would be doing the movements that we know we do swimming, which is moving our shoulders. And if we're running, we'd be warming up our legs. If we're golfing, we'd be doing swings of the arms. So we're warming up those muscles that we're about to use. After exercise, then it's a good time to stretch. So that was different from what I'd heard. And 2 people in the book have said that to me.
Yeah, right. So we warm up and then we don't stretch at all before we exercise and we only stretch afterwards. Is that what
afterwards? That is the theory. Yeah. Which kind of makes sense. Sort of makes sense, doesn't it? But,
it does. It does. And with the joints thing, because that's really so listeners, this guru that Alix has been talking about is Alix de Giovanni, right? I've got all my notes here. I've got so many notes from all the interviews you did, Alix. They're just so many thought-provoking things. And one thing that, so I went to an ashram a few months ago, and I've been several times. And the first time I went there, I was really surprised because, as per usual, they do yoga in the morning, right? But it was a different kind of yoga to anything I'd ever done before. And when I read that chapter, I thought that's what they do. It's all about joint rotation. And that was it. There weren't any sort of big stretches or anything like that. It was
poses.
Sorry, no poses. No. It was all sitting on the floor, mostly sitting on the floor, some lying, some whatever. But it was all about going through the different parts of the body and doing joint rotation. And I remember, when I was doing it the first time, I was thinking, oh God, this isn't.
I'm not doing anything.
I'm used to being more active. But afterwards, and I tend to do it a couple of times a week now. I should probably do it a bit more often than that. But it really struck me, and I bought one of actually I bought 2 of the guides just for the basic exercises and sort of different orders in which you can do the rotations. And I got one for my mum as well, because I thought this is really, we're into this, there's something in this.
Yes. And it's not hard, is it?
No,
it's not hard. So I rarely miss a morning doing that. And sometimes even in bed, I start to, whirl my ankles around and after sleep and get everything sort of moving again. And then at nighttime, Victor Purton, who's the founder of the Center for Optimism, which I love, he talks about the fact that optimism is 25% heritable, which I thought was interesting. In other words, he claims that we can all develop our optimism. And one of the things he suggests in terms of doing that is at night, before we go to bed, write down 3 things for which we've been grateful during the day. And what has really changed in my life is sometimes you're searching for I've had a bad day in a way. What am I grateful for? Well, when you read the papers and realize that very few people have enough water to drink, and all I do is just turn on a tap and I get a glass of fresh water. I have hot showers. I walk by a beautiful cyclamen. I mean, a friend gave me a call and asked how I was. These can be very simple things. There's always something of joy in every day. So you write down those 3 things before you go to sleep and look at them first thing in the morning. I don't always write them down, but I always say them to myself before I go to sleep.
Yeah. I really enjoyed his chapter, and as I said to you before we started chatting today, before we sort of did this interview, I'm going to reread that chapter, and I've got one of the things that really struck me from the chapter was that he refers to being realistic and being optimistic. Realistic optimism. So often being realistic, I think, is actually kind of being pessimistic. But here, one of the things that he said is kind of the ways he thinks of optimism is actually just saying, I can work through this. I can work through this.
Yes.
So
whereas if you were really pessimistic, you'd think, no hope. What's the point?
Yeah. Yeah, I can work through this.
Yes.
So there's no element of defeat and there's an element there of encouraging self-belief in ourselves too.
That's interesting. Yes.
And having faith in ourselves. And there's, as you say, so many of the things that these experts mention, they're simple.
Yes.
And it's often the simple things that are the most powerful, aren't they?
Well, I've heard a few people have said to me it's very accessible, and I like that.
Yeah.
That it's something we can all. There are so many tips in the book from so many different vantage points, and you can have it on your bedside table and pick up and read. The chapters are short. It's not a demanding read, but I hope it just gives some ideas, and not all the ideas will suit every reader, but there might be 1 or 2 things. I can do that. That's something I can do.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I think there's definitely something for everyone, something that can help everyone in this book.
Oh, well, I hope so, Sal. Thank you.
Oh, no, I'm saying that because I truly believe it, and another thing that struck me was it was the sleep chapter. Oh, was it the sleep chapter? Joshua Frank.
Oh, he's lovely. Well, all of these people too, I have such high regard for. Now, he's a masseur, which sounds, well, there are a lot of masseurs, but to me, he's exceptional because he was born into a family of physio, and a gifted masseur was his father. And so from when he was a tot, he was starting to learn about bodies and massage and things, and you could just be in his presence and you feel so much better. What was it that you saw in what he said, Sal? I interrupted you.
Oh, no, that's all right. Well, no, now that you're talking about him, one of the things was that he was massaging his parents for his pocket money. I loved that when he was little. But the thing that I took on board was, as you know, and as viewers can see, I've got a long neck, right? And he said that in anyone over 30 who he sees as clients, anyone over 30 who sleeps on their tummy has neck problems.
Yeah, that was interesting, wasn't it?
And I often sleep on my tummy. And I often have a stiff neck and shoulders.
Oh my goodness.
And now I was thinking about ways I can, during my sleep, because it's not one of the easier habits to kind of change because we're doing, it's when we're asleep. But I was thinking, one of my friends is a GP, and if people have sleep apnea when they're in a certain position, she gets them to tie thing around their waist with a tennis ball in the
Oh my
spot where
goodness.
where
Yes.
they don't want to be lying on. So I was thinking, well, I can do that.
Yes.
To prevent myself from going down onto my tummy. Because that could really change my life, actually.
It sort of makes sense. If you're on a massage table, your head goes through a hole, doesn't it, when you're on your tummy?
Yeah.
But if you're sleeping on your tummy, your head has to go somewhere, and it's usually in a funny position, isn't it? Or sideways, or yes.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
But what I'd also love to know is, you had your parents who already prompted you in thinking about how do we grow older well, or how do we have more energy, these sorts of questions. What did you observe in them?
Well, I guess one of the main things, there were a lot of things I observed and think about retrospectively. It was a lot to do with their attitude. So as we get older, whether we like it or not, we lose, our eyesight deteriorates, or sometimes our hearing deteriorates. We're unable to do as much physical exercise. So that can be very depressing for older people. With my parents, they somehow just, they were more, you could almost say they were more like children, because if you observe children are always, they're always curious and they're excited and they notice things and they're thinking about what they're going to do today. And my parents were rather like that. If they thought about the past, it was never, the good old days and look how awful it was never like that. It was only to say, do you remember that party we went to, with the so-and-sos? Wasn't that a hoot, etc. That was their past experience. Yeah. And then it was always about what we were going to do today. My father in his 80s, I remember he went to a tennis camp. And he came back and he said they all thought it was a bit unusual that I was there, and he couldn't work out why it was unusual. He wanted to improve his tennis in his 80s. Yeah. And that was his only thought. And I can remember my mother calling me up in the morning and she said, "It's a blue sky day. I've said we need to go to Dalesford." So off they'd go for a day in Dalesford. Yeah. So they were always sort of just enjoying what was happening and looking forward to the next thing. Now, my mother loved reading, and she had macular degeneration and she lost her sight. So that could have been devastating. Well, she said, I can listen to audiobooks. And so she switched to audiobooks. So, I admire the way they adapted, and had something to do with attitude, I think.
Yeah. Thank you for those examples. I'm just, I'm just sort of feeling my way through those. That's quite wonderful. Yeah. Just a moment for pause, as you said. A moment for pause. So, Alix, if people want to get hold of Energy for Life, how do they do that?
I am delighted to say that it seems to be in most bookshops. It's also available online. But sometimes if I'm walking by a bookshop I don't know, I pop in and say, "Do you have my book by any chance?" They say, "What is your book?" And I did that recently in Hawkesbury in Melbourne. And there were 3 books on the shelves, and they wanted me to sign them, and they put me on their Instagram. And so, but in many ways, Sal, I don't think of it as my book. I think of it as their book. Yeah. All these people and they were so good to be interviewed. They didn't know would ever be published or anything. They were so good to have me interview them. And if I can spread the word about all the things that they do and all the willingness to give us ideas about how to look after ourselves, I am delighted.
No, well, Alix, thank you for interviewing those experts. Thank you for writing the book. And thank you so much for your time and your generosity today.
Oh, I've enjoyed it very much, Sal. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
It's been such a pleasure. And listeners and viewers, thank you also for joining us and for being a part of this community and this conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Sal.